nice that you joined, that you're here. What is my channel all about? Maybe let's start exactly there. My channel is about the invisible wounds that no one sees, but you experience. And that's the tricky part, because often we know exactly who we are, how we are, and that's the way our personality is. That's often when maybe you notice it yourself, you're saying, yeah, but that's just who I am. And what do I mean when I talk about the invisible wounds? I'm talking about things that somehow still impact your life. Things that make you feel overwhelmed, that come with anxiety, that comes often with the very precise feelings of shame, guilt, and a harsh inner voice. That harsh inner voice is your loud thoughts, the thoughts of I'm not good enough, that the thought that shames you, that criticizes you, that belittles you in some ways, that gaslights you. And sometimes we carry that inside of ourselves. The tricky part with invisible wounds is that these wounds that often, and yes, they are created in our childhood when our personality is basically formed. And basically what personality means is the takeaways and the beliefs, how you can believe what you can believe about yourself, others, in the world around you, in the world that you're living in. That's the feedback that you receive from your parent, caretakers, from your immediate environment about yourself. And sometimes it's also the absence of things. So that's where it becomes very tricky, because the absence and lack of, for example, emotional safety, of unconditional love is very much, quote unquote, something we are very used to and we can get very used to. But the way a child would manage and cope with this is, and it runs and it's an instinct from survival, is by I'm coping the best way I can. And often that is for a child, for example, being stuck in your mind, thinking things through. And often the takeaways are, because children have, of course, different minds and a different brain, children don't have that aspect of I'm making that step away, that logical step of maybe it's mom, it's dad, it's the teacher, whoever is in your immediate environment. No, they have the takeaway. It's me. It's me, and that becomes part of, quote unquote, your personality, who you feel and think you are. It creates those belief systems, those thoughts, those thought patterns a lot of times. And for many, that shows up in very different ways. And if you look into my channel and the things that I post here, is I show you sometimes behaviors, how it looks like in adult life. And you can probably relate to a lot of them if you look in my channel. But those are actually a lot of times coping mechanisms or ways we try to survive that eventually became so normal to ourselves that we feel that's who we are. But if you checked in deep down with yourself, maybe you notice, but I am anxious, or I'm not really happy, or, and that's another thing, that's a trauma response. And when I talk about trauma, remember, I mean the emotional wounds that no one sees, but you experience. Maybe you can only feel like I can only show and share parts of myself, parts of who I am. That even happens a lot of times in romantic relationship or other friendships, where we feel like I'm only showing this part of myself, because the other part we feel a deep shame, or we feel like this could be not good enough, or if we share our needs or true self, a lot of times it can come with those deep feelings of abandonment, the fear of being basically left alone, the feeling of it's not good enough, or we're feeling criticized. And that is something that immediately, and when we talk about trauma, wounds, it becomes a red line in your life. It's been created somewhere, and often in your upbringing, often in your childhood, where again these core beliefs are created about yourself. And we, as a natural instinct, we as human beings, we don't like to live with fear, with anxiety. So your brain, but also your nervous system, jump in for the rescue, but not always with the best feelings. It's best intentions, yes, but it also makes you feel a certain way. So again, it goes into, oh, I feel very anxious. Maybe you have phases of depression, often signs actually in your daily life that somewhere in your life something didn't go as well as you maybe have needed it, or you thought it would be, and you've wrapped yourself around it just to survive. So that's the tricky part with the invisible wounds that no one sees but you experience. And when I say, and every time when I say the word trauma, and as you notice, I'm steering away from it a little bit, because a lot of people feel like, oh, but I'm excluded from this. I don't have trauma. Let's shed some light on that word. Trauma means wound, and we all carry wounds to some extent. But some have lived, and that's a difficult truth sometimes, a whole life with wounds being created over and over. And how does it look like? It can look like that you grew up with parents who were, one, let's say, not emotionally available, or the other very anxious. It can be, and a lot of people live like this, with a parent who is emotionally immature or very much mentally not stable, struggles mentally themselves. Um, it can be around an alcoholic parent, things like that. But children, as a survival instinct, they need to survive. They depend on their parents. So they will find a way to make this happen and to cope. But in another way, we also want to make our parents deeply happy. It's a natural instinct as well. We want to fit into the family. So what do? We would, for example, if we have a parent who is, let's say, mentally not stable, we would take over that emotional load and emotional weight of our parent and jump in and become their caretaker to some extent. Or if there's a deeply unsafe parent, someone who's constantly stressed, angry, unpredictable, we would tune out of our body and tune into that parent. And that's where emotional monitoring and people pleasing, and I hate that word because it's fawning, it's a survival instinct, kicks in. And it becomes very normal, and maybe you're overly empathetic, maybe you're a very kind person, but the sign where you can know, I maybe have invisible wounds, quote unquote traumas in my life that I need to heal and address, is because if you are very empathetic, and trust me, this is a wonderful superpower to have, but if you are overly empathetic without boundaries, and maybe you notice things when criticism comes your way, you feel very much triggered and it goes in unfiltered, and it hurts you by the core, or it kind of like really pulls the rug under your feet, and you're feeling that you're doing things for others, let's say constantly and all the time, without putting yourself on the priority list, that is a sign that you've somewhere lived a life where that was needed, where that was survival, but it became who you are, but it doesn't make you and give you a full life. A full life basically meaning that you feel that you're also participating, playing a role, that your needs are met. The problem is, and that's the most tricky part, and that's actually where most people come to me, they're like, I'm struggling in my relationship. And it's often the romantic ones. It's often the ones where we feel like I deeply would want to be seen and heard. But often some people find themselves again with the emotional unavailable partner, with the avoidant, with the sometimes abuser, with the relationship where you feel like you're giving, over giving, and maybe the way it shows up for you is like you're sitting there with resentment, anxiety, and one of the worst things that actually is another sign that you're dealing with invisible wounds. If you're constantly sitting in self-doubt, doubting yourself, your own actions, the things that you're doing, and you feel a sense of loneliness at the same time, this is a huge sign that there is healing of those invisible wounds needed. Because self doubt does change eventually not just your brain, it is also something that changes your entire system and constantly throws you back into a stress response. What's a stress response? It shows up like fight, flight, or freeze. And what is that? Fight or flight would be, I'm very agitated. I'm going into, let's say, that can look like, for example, being very explosive from 0 to 100. But probably you've thought a lot about things, like, for example, things built up in your mind and eventually you snap. But it can also look into, again, for example, fawning and people pleasing. I'm like giving you a lot. I'm just whatever the piece would require so that things are okay. But deep down, you feel very lonely and doubtful, and you're trying to constantly jump in, fix yourself, change yourself, maybe even jump in for the other person, trying to bring them into something where they would maybe change for you just a tiny bit, and you're linking it always to hoping and waiting. But again, it actually doesn't bring you any happiness at all. And freeze would be, well, you're just kind of like, you feel stuck, you feel extremely overwhelmed, and sometimes you don't even recall things anymore. And some people also disassociate in those moments, so they can actually not even feel any of their feelings anymore. They cannot even access what's going on in their body, but their mind is maybe rushing, and that is very much overwhelming, very difficult in so many ways. But it also, and that's the other thing, keeps you in unhealthy relationships, in an unhealthy life, that sometimes you've just felt like, oh, it's so normal by this point. A lot of things that I address actually of these wounds are part of my basically trauma healing program, Phoenix, because the thing is, and that's the truth, a lot of people struggle these days with these invisible wounds. And what we are doing in my program, and people always ask me, what's the work that you're doing? I'm teaching them the language, a new language, a language that sometimes feels very unfamiliar and new. That's the new language of your inner state, of your inner world. That means of your nervous system, of course, but also your mind, but also how you can catch yourself. Because the most important thing is, once you're not just understood, and that's self-awareness, what's going on inside of you, mapping your true self out, basically, why things are happening, why certain thoughts are constantly coming up, why you maybe feel a certain way. Those can be emotional flashbacks of your past constantly popping up. Maybe you constantly feel anxious, or you feel shame, guilt, like I said before, or that harsh inner critic. Those are ways of feeling, but also making you think a certain way. And once you understood this, but you also have the tools, the practices to change it, not just mapping it out, but also stopping basically those emotional flashbacks, your programs, your subconscious, these beliefs that I talked about earlier that have been created somewhere in your life out of survival. Once we heal those wounds, address it, map your internal out, you are able, and you will be able, not just to speak to yourself differently. And I think we've got this totally wrong. Like, a lot of times we feel like, it's so important how we communicate with others, how we're perceived by others, what feedback we receive by others. It's also society, obviously, in school and all of those things. We're graded, rated in so many ways. But no one really talks about the first and most important relationship is the one with yourself. It's getting to know yourself, understanding yourself, being honest with yourself, not just in your mind, but also within your body, allowing emotions to travel through you, not avoiding them or trying to suppress them. That's something we also do very much, particularly when we are very stressed or stuck in survival mode, and we can be stuck in it for decades. I think that's where a lot of people also have that misconception of like, yeah, time heals the wounds. No, it doesn't. The reality is, and that's why learning that new language, reconnecting with yourself is so important, because only once you understood yourself, you have a language within yourself that is loving, compassionate, kind. Don't, it's not about toxic positivity, it's about honest, caring, being very much like solid, grounded, and having built a wonderful foundation. Then you can start building the house. And that means not just yourself, your personality, but also who are you inviting in your house. And that's the relationships that you have, the people you work with, and so on and so forth. This is super important. Most of the time these days, we learn to build houses, we learn to invite people in, and unfortunately the front door for a lot of people, and it's the absence of boundaries, not because you didn't want to have boundaries, but because that concept of boundaries is for many people actually really, really new. The front door is wide open. So basically, we learn to not, and we learn to allow everyone in. And that's the thing. But if the foundation is also not there, and that's you, that's the love that you hold for yourself, it's that feeling of, I know deeply, and not just knowing in your mind, but feeling it in your body. I know who I really am. And again, that's not about self-centeredness. It's not about narcissism. It is about a felt experience. I know who I am. I feel very much like this is okay for me. That's not okay for me. That's a boundary. These felt experiences are so, so important, but change your entire life. And trust me, I'm not just talking from textbook. I'm not just talking from things that I've heard on social media. No, I've lived this myself, first of all, but I'm also, because I'm a psychologist, literally became a super ultra nerd on this because so many people are struggling and so many people don't even know who they are. They feel like they don't have their identity anymore. We struggle with deep sense of loneliness. We do struggle, and that's a fact based on statistics, with relationships, romantic ones, work relationship, friendships, you name it. But it is a lot of times because we've lived a life, and as I'm saying this out there, very much genuinely and honestly mean that, we are the generations of war of wounds. War of wounds, what does that mean? A lot of times, and it's not about blaming, and please hear me out, it's not about blaming our parents or our grandparents and blame shifting and putting the responsibility of our healing onto them. No, it's about understanding and awareness of like, hey, there is something that we've lived now for generations. It's There's those kind of dynamics that, and again, everyone comes from a different country, but a lot of times things are the same. For example, if you grew up with a dominant father, a very anxious mother, what's their dynamic? The mother is always a lot of times very pleasing. She's like stressed and hyped, but also gives you a message. Your father gives you a message too, with his dominance, which is basically being fearful, unpredictable. Both of them give the child a message. What's that message? The message is, first of all, this is a model and we are mirroring creatures as humans. Like, okay, this is how I don't want my relationship to be. Your mother basically shares you most of the time. That's a bit of the pattern. Don't become dependent on a man, as an example. It can also be the other way around, but don't ever become dependent on anyone. Your father, through the wounds and the absence of things, but also the dominance of him, sends you the message of, you are not good enough. You need to work for love. You need to prove yourself. You need to be the good child in order to be seen and heard and be part of, let's say, the dynamic. But my father, my values, my presence is more important than yours. So what does it create? It creates wounds. It creates those invisible wounds in that child. So that child grows up stressed. That is a very normal feeling. So maybe you don't even notice it anymore, but you're becoming like, and your nervous system is just chronically stressed. But it also lives outside of you. You're constantly scanning people for their facial expression, for their mood, and you become sometimes overly empathetic, but also very pleasing. And that means I'm just avoiding and steering away from trouble. But another thing is, and that's where it becomes really complicated, and that's also why trauma is not just so simple and one thing. It does actually bring other behaviors. For example, absolute perfectionism. There is no such thing as perfect, but as a result, we constantly try. Whatever we do perfect, we do 120%. It comes with a lot of times being the working bee, and maybe you overexhaust yourself because of the lack of boundaries. You would be like, and your mind is very smart in it. It always tells you, well, you can rest later, keep going once you've reached a goal. But that sort of hamster wheel of goal setting never ends, and you go into the next, into the next, into the next, and you actually can never actually even feel an important feeling that we need, and that healing also brings back, is gratefulness. We are constantly criticizing ourselves, being like, I could have done better, I should have been faster, I need more. We compare on the outside world, not just our looks, but also our achievements, and so on and so forth. So the list is really long, but you hear me talk. And can you imagine how that feels for a human being? How overwhelmed that is with a list of things, these requirements of, this is how I should live life. This is the perfect human being. This is basically how for a lot of people it plays out in their life. And that's a survival response. And that puts you into survival mode, into a huge stress response, constantly living like this. It's like that to-do list that never ends. the things that never end, the anxiety that never ends. And maybe we're very good in coping as a teenager because there's often also no choice. But in the early 20s, there's a lot of distraction around, and but eventually, and that's not a sign of weakness, it's actually a sign of just being human. A lot of times the mind and your body are overwhelmed. And even though your mind keeps on pushing your body, and that's where we have also a lot of times physical impacts and things, particularly in our early 30s or 40s and 50s, because eventually stress actually shows. And that's what trauma is. It's constantly being stuck in stress. It shows neck pain, migraines, lower back pains, you name it. Autoimmune disorders, there's a lot of research out there at this point. Super important to understand, but also, and that's the work that I like to do, is that we can come back to our authentic self, the person before all the stress, the trauma, the things that happened, that person. And when I say that, it sounds very spiritual. What it is actually that you were supposed to be, that person that you deep down still want to be, but is sometimes overshadowed by all the wounds and the things and the overwhelm that is happening in your life. So how to do this? And that's obviously a very reasonable question to ask, because like, okay, now I know it, I figured it out, but it doesn't change. Knowing will never change anything. It will give you the awareness, and sometimes knowing has also that feeling of like, okay, now I see it, but it makes my shame, the inner critic, that feeling of not good enough, even worse, because now I see it happening. So you cannot unsee it, but you still don't know the how-tos, and the how-tos are often more simple than we actually think. But the thing is, your nervous system and your mind do need consistency. And sometimes that's where we need help. That's where we need help through therapists, through program, through somatic work, through someone, a coach, whatever is there, someone who understands that we need to not just challenge your mind, your thoughts. That's talk therapy. We need actually a little bit more than that. We don't need to talk about what happened to us on end. We need to understand, where are those wounds? What are my wounds? How do they play out in our mind, the way we think, the way we behave? And then it's like, what can I do? How can I bring, and that's a very, 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 very important first step. How can I actually bring in safety into my nervous system? Because frankly, only once you feel safe, then you can actually do and continue on your healing journey and actually change also your mind. So before all of it, we need to really look into, how can I physically feel safe? What's an unsafe feeling, you might ask? Fear, which is immediately linked to major anxiety, for some people panic, but also an unsafe feeling is depression, that heaviness, that feeling of I cannot lift myself out of bed anymore. And that is so important to understand. First, I need to care for my body, because something is making my body feel unsafe. And your thoughts do play a major role in it, because your thoughts are often created and rise out of stress and survival and make you feel even more unstable and unsafe. So, safety starts with somatic healing, the inner healing, bringing in nervous system safety. Once we have that, then we can, and that's the beauty of neuroplasticity, that means your brain can change, that means also your thought patterns can change. We can rewire ourself, and that means also those conscious or subconscious beliefs that have been created in our upbringing, those can all change. But it takes consistency and the right kind of tools and practices. And that's what I put into my Phoenix program, because I've been there myself. So it's not that I have mastered it and I'm like, again, talking from textbooks. No, I know exactly how it feels to feel unsafe, how it feels to feel overwhelmed, exhausted, you name it. But there is a step-by-step plan that you can follow, and that's a lot of times what we need when we are overwhelmed, when we are doubtful, when we are in survival. Because in survival, we cannot make really rational decisions. We cannot choose what's good for us or not. We're doubting, we're insecure, we are basically exhausted. And what we need is we need a bit of a step-by-step plan without having to think too much, just following it and seeing how you can come back to yourself. And then everything changes. And that is a beautiful message that I want to tell you. You are able to change and heal. And even if you feel like, I don't think that's possible, please check the reviews on my Phoenix program. People can, and so can you. There's no age limit to it, which is a beautiful message. I think you don't have to think and live with anxiety, these emotional flashbacks, or if you think, and there's also vivid flashbacks, that you still think of moments in your past and you're like, this keeps me up at night. I'm overthinking in my mind constantly all the time. Maybe you can relate. Bedtime is for a lot of people a huge no moment of like, I dread it, I don't like it, because when we go to bed, things basically fall on our feet. We cannot avoid it. Our mind sometimes starts spiraling. Maybe you become even that time traveler. You go into the past, you overthink the things that you've said, the things that you've done, you could have done differently, or you go into the worst case scenario thinking. The thinking of like, what if, or into the do lists of tomorrow, the things that could go wrong. But that in itself is hugely overwhelming. But again, another sign, if that continuously happens, that there's somewhere unhealed wounds that need to be addressed. So this is basically my first time live on YouTube telling you, please prioritize yourself. There is never a right moment, and the mind works wonders on making excuses to keep you sometimes in exactly the familiar. Why does it want to keep you in the familiar? Because even if it's painful and you don't like where you're at, it's predictable. You know the pain, and sometimes knowing the pain is easier than walking into the unknown. But I want to encourage you and tell you the unknown, even though it might trigger also uncomfortable feelings, which could be stress, anxiety, but the known, that's constantly what you know, will bring you exactly where you are. Maybe exhausted, overwhelmed, anxious, stressed, depressed, not okay, unhappy, in unhappy relationships. But the other side, if you step into the unknown, and that's where we need sometimes help and someone, a shoulder, a group, community, whatever it is to lean on, we actually walk into a life that you really want, you deserve, and that feels so much different, and you feel so much different within yourself. That sense of almost inner freedom, that feeling of like, wow, I feel the first time like myself. That brings back the silly you, the funny you, the sometimes child self, the person that's deeply comfortable in being uncomfortable and just being yourself and showing all parts of you, because that is really truly being yourself. Being like, it means I'll be myself full on. Maybe in uncomfortable moments, maybe just like I did. I never spoke in front of people, always been uncomfortable. I'm showing up now. And I actually generally say, like, yeah, even if I'm not saying always the 100% right things, or if I'm like, yeah, like now, lost a little bit in my own thoughts, it's okay. It's fine. I still am. I'm me. I'm Caroline, and I love who I am. And again, that's not narcissism. That's not selfish. It's just I deeply know who I am and what I stand for, what my morals are. I feel so deeply connected and I feel free within myself. No one holds a power over me. And yes, a lot of times, and you can get that here on platforms like this, there's always a bit of judgment. There are trolls, there are people who have their opinion, and you're always free to have your opinion. But one thing I know, I'm not everyone's cup of tea, but for some people I am. And that's a deep sense of knowing. And that's a wish for so many people, that we can be ourselves, our individual selves, that we don't budge or please or become the version that we feel like we have to be, a social chameleon. No, there is a beauty in you being individually you. And that's also happiness. That's living a full life that allows you real emotional intimacy with others. That's not just intimacy how you maybe think, but a conversation changes once you know yourself. It changes in its depth, it becomes more connected, and it changes basically everything. And that is the beauty of life. You will encounter other people um, that feel the same, that are maybe on the same journey, but it becomes from surface level communication and only showing parts of you to being who you really are, to deep connections, friendships, maybe romantic relationships, but also choosing the work that you like to do. Um, it's immediately linked to how valuable you feel you are. A lot of people live with insecurities. Again, insecurities are nothing negative. We all hold them to an extent, but knowing them and knowing how to address them is very different. And that's a total different language that I like to teach in my program. So if you're curious about it, go and check in the feed. There is like my Phoenix program. You can see it on carolinemidelsdorf.com. Check it out. Thanks for being so patient with me on my first live at YouTube. I love it. Happy to be here. We'll be here more often. So please also come and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on our coffee talks and more videos, more information, but more things that you can relate to. And if you haven't had the chance to, check out my podcast, because it's all for free. It's things out there, and hopefully helpful experts are on it, people who share their story, who are vulnerable. Check out my podcast, Real, Raw, and Authentic, because maybe it's helping you on your journey as well. Thank you so much for listening, for liking, subscribing, and I'll see you very soon again. Bye bye.